If you want to understand how global politics, regime changes, and economic power shape the world we live in, make sure to subscribe to Capital Explained, where complex world events are broken down in the simplest way. What happens after a regime change? On paper, the idea sounds simple. A country has an unstable or oppressive leader, that leader is removed, and a new government aligned with American interests is installed. In theory, stability should follow. But history shows that it rarely works that way. In 2001, it was Afghanistan. In 2003, Iraq. In 2011, Libya. And now, attention seems to be turning toward Iran. However, Iran is very different from the countries that came before it. It holds the world's third largest oil reserves and sits at the center of a complex network of regional alliances. If instability begins there, the consequences may not remain limited to one nation. It could create a power vacuum stretching from Lebanon to Yemen, threaten the Strait of Hormuz, and ultimately affect fuel prices and economies across the world. Over the 80 years since the Second World War, the United States has spent nearly 60 years involved in some form of military conflict. These wars have reached almost every region of the globe and have cost trillions of dollars. In the 1960s, the Vietnam War was fought to contain communism. In the early 2000s, Iraq was invaded over fears of weapons of mass destruction. In 2011, Libya faced similar intervention against Colonel Gaddafi. The reasoning behind these actions remained largely the same. Spreading democracy was believed to create global stability, and a stable world was expected to make America safer and more prosperous. The United States was not the first power to follow this strategy. The British Empire reshaped borders across the Middle East. The Soviet Union established aligned governments throughout Eastern Europe. Even Napoleon attempted to install friendly regimes across Europe. Regime change has long been part of great power politics. Yet despite its frequent use, success has been rare. Out of roughly 28 attempts at regime change by the United States, only 3 are widely considered successful: Germany, Japan, and Panama. The key question then is why these efforts often fail, and why a similar attempt in Iran could face the same outcome. The answer lies less in military strength or political intention, and more in how a country's economy functions and how money flows within it. In most Western nations, economic power is decentralized. Countries like the United States or the United Kingdom operate from the bottom up. Millions of individuals and businesses produce goods and services, earn income, and pay taxes. Those taxes fund public services such as infrastructure, healthcare, and national defense. Because governments rely on citizens for revenue, they remain dependent on economic activity generated by the population. In many resource-rich states, however, this relationship works in reverse. Governments do not depend primarily on citizens for income. Instead, they generate massive revenue directly from natural resources such as oil. Wealth flows from the ground into state accounts, allowing governments to distribute money, subsidies, jobs, and benefits to the population. In this system, people rely on the state rather than the state relying on its people. This model, described by Iranian economist Hossein Mahdavi in the 1970s, is known as a rentier state. In such countries, political stability often depends on a simple exchange. The government controls national wealth and distributes enough of it to maintain public compliance. Saudi Arabia, for example, has maintained stability for decades using this structure. Problems begin when that distribution system collapses, when an external intervention or internal breakdown removes the central authority managing resources. The entire structure can unravel. This is exactly what happened in Iraq after the removal of Saddam Hussein in 2003. Oil made up around 95% of Iraq's export revenue and a large share of its economy. The state controlled this sector entirely, meaning salaries, subsidies, food programs, and infrastructure spending all depended on government distribution. When the regime fell, replacing the leader also meant replacing the entire economic system overnight. Unlike Western democracies, where government changes rarely disrupt everyday economic life, in a rentier state, the government itself is the foundation holding everything together. Removing it is like pulling the final block from a Jenga tower. The situation worsened when the Iraqi military was dissolved and senior members of Saddam Hussein's ruling party were banned from public office. Nearly 300,000 trained soldiers suddenly lost their income, pensions, and role in society. Many of these individuals later joined insurgent groups, forming the backbone of conflicts that followed for years. When the system distributing wealth collapses, it creates not just instability but competition for control. Oil facilities, military assets, and state resources become prizes fought over by rival factions. Although countries like Iraq or Libya may appear wealthy due to natural resources, large portions of their populations often live in poverty. The sudden absence of centralized authority turns control of the state into a high-stakes struggle. History shows that in such environments, the groups most willing to use violence often gain power. As law and order weaken, extremist organizations expand their influence. Ordinary citizens frequently align with whichever group can provide security, electricity, or basic services, regardless of ideology. This creates a difficult paradox. Removing a dictator may seem morally and politically justified, but when the entire economy depends on that centralized regime, its removal can leave society fragmented and vulnerable to even more extreme forces. Some argue that regime change fails only because foreign powers withdraw too soon. According to this view, longer military presence and greater investment might allow democratic institutions to develop over time. Germany and Japan are often cited as examples. However, these successes occurred under very specific conditions. Both nations already possess strong institutions, educated populations, functioning bureaucracies, and advanced industrial economies before World War II. Reconstruction rebuilt existing systems rather than creating entirely new ones. Additionally, the presence of nearby geopolitical threats during the Cold War gave local populations a reason to cooperate with American forces. In more recent conflicts, such shared external threats were largely absent. Without a common enemy, foreign military presence itself became the focus of resistance. Afghanistan illustrates this clearly. Despite 2 decades of occupation, massive financial investment, and large troop deployments, the Taliban regained control within days of the U.S. withdrawal. Over time, resentment toward foreign forces strengthened insurgent recruitment rather than weakening it. The pattern becomes clear. When a resource-dependent state collapses after regime change, instability often spreads far beyond the removal of a single leader. Instead of creating order, it can trigger prolonged conflict, economic disruption, and regional power struggles whose consequences reach far beyond national borders. The economy often collapses almost overnight after a regime falls. Armed groups begin fighting for control over whatever resources remain, and in most cases, the most extreme faction eventually rises to power. At the same time, the longer a foreign military presence continues, the more that force starts to be viewed as an enemy rather than a stabilizer. Countries like Iraq, Libya, and Afghanistan all followed variations of this same pattern. What makes the current situation different is that the country now being discussed is not a small or isolated nation, but Iran. With a population of nearly 90 million people and the world's 3rd largest oil reserves, Iran holds enormous strategic importance. It has also already experienced a form of regime change in the past. In 1953, Iran had a democratically elected prime minister who nationalized the country's oil industry, taking control away from British interests. In response, a coup organized by the CIA and MI6 removed him from power and installed the Shah as ruler. For about 25 years, the arrangement appeared successful. However, resentment gradually built within Iranian society, and in 1979, it exploded into the Islamic Revolution. The Shah was overthrown, and a new political system was deliberately designed to ensure that foreign powers could never easily remove it again. This creates a crucial difference between Iran and countries such as Saddam Hussein's Iraq or Gaddafi's Libya. Iran's system is not centered around a single individual. Instead, it operates through multiple layers of power, including military, religious, and economic institutions that have spent more than 4 decades adapting to sanctions and external pressure. Because of this structure, there is no single point whose removal would cause the entire system to collapse. The United States and Israel appear to understand this reality, which is why strategies have focused not only on individuals but on multiple leadership and operational centers at once. Yet even this approach does not eliminate the underlying challenge. Iran is deeply connected to a regional network of allied and proxy groups stretching from Lebanon to Yemen. On paper, the argument for regime change can sound convincing. Remove a hostile government, weaken proxy networks, prevent nuclear escalation, and replace the leadership with a more moderate alternative. However, history repeatedly shows that outcomes rarely unfold as neatly as planned. If leadership in Iran were replaced, several possible scenarios could emerge, but most fall into four broad outcomes. The first, and perhaps the most optimistic, would be the emergence of a new governing system, possibly democratic or based on a revived constitutional structure. Public dissatisfaction with the current system is real, and surveys have suggested that a large portion of Iranians might support political change if given the opportunity. Protests such as the Women Life Freedom movement in 2022 demonstrated that desire clearly. However, history suggests that popular demand alone does not determine who ultimately gains power. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, ideology disappeared quickly, but chaos followed. State assets were rapidly divided among powerful insiders, creating oligarchs while institutions struggled to function. The old power networks never truly vanished. They simply reorganized under new leadership. By the time Vladimir Putin rose promising stability, the same security structures that existed before had already secured control over key industries like oil and gas. A similar outcome could occur in Iran. Much of the country's economy is controlled by the state, especially sectors linked to energy, manufacturing, and finance. Power is divided mainly between religious institutions, including the supreme leader and influential foundations known as bonyads, and the security establishment led by the Revolutionary Guard. Over decades, these groups have built extensive economic influence across construction, telecommunications, energy, and trade networks. Since oil and gas revenues fund a large portion of government income, those controlling these systems hold real authority regardless of public opinion. This means that even if millions demand change, the individuals and organizations controlling infrastructure, banks, and export systems are unlikely to surrender power simply through elections. Even the best-case transition could end up looking very similar to the current structure, only under different leadership. A second and far more realistic possibility is widespread instability rather than smooth transition. Iran currently oversees a network of armed groups across the region, including Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Hamas. While these organizations operate aggressively, they still function within a broader hierarchy influenced by Tehran. The existence of a central state imposes at least some limits on their actions. If that central authority disappeared, those restraints could vanish as well. Thousands of trained and heavily armed fighters would suddenly operate without centralized direction. History shows how dangerous such vacuums can become. After the Iraq invasion, extremist groups quickly expanded and filled the gap left by the collapsed state. Many of the militias connected to Iran today are far more organized and better equipped than insurgent groups seen in earlier conflicts. Some possess advanced weapons stockpiles comparable to those of national armies. Without coordination from a functioning government, factions could fragment, radicalize further, or even sell their military expertise to the highest bidder across global conflict zones. Internal divisions would likely intensify the crisis. Iran is not entirely ethnically uniform. Alongside Persians live large populations of Azeris, Kurds, Arabs, and Baloch communities. For decades, centralized authority has kept these regional tensions contained. If that authority weakened, demands for autonomy could rapidly emerge, potentially drawing neighboring countries into the conflict. The most critical concern lies in southwestern Iran, where significant oil infrastructure overlaps with ethnic minority regions. Any conflict there would not remain a domestic issue, but could quickly become a global energy crisis. Iran also controls access to the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most vital oil transit routes. Regional powers such as Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Turkey could become involved, turning instability into a large-scale proxy conflict. Such chaos would almost certainly trigger massive migration flows. Millions could attempt to move westward through Turkey toward Europe, while eastern pressure would affect Pakistan and Central Asian nations already facing economic and political strain. To prevent this outcome, Western countries might attempt to maintain a strong military presence and support a friendly replacement government, similar to earlier historical attempts. A comparable strategy was used in Iran in 1953 when Western-backed leadership initially stabilized the country and accelerated modernization. At one point, Iran was even described as the Paris of the Middle East. However, that alignment also created deep resentment. Over time, many Iranians came to associate the ruling system with foreign interference. By 1979, opposition movements united around the belief that national sovereignty had been compromised, ultimately producing a revolution that replaced the monarchy with a far more hardline regime. Today's geopolitical environment is even more complex. Iran maintains strategic relationships with both Russia and China. Russia has strengthened military cooperation, while China remains a major buyer of Iranian oil and has significant economic investments tied to regional infrastructure projects. Neither country would likely accept a sudden shift, placing Iran firmly under Western influence. Support for opposing factions, financial backing, or proxy involvement would become highly probable. In reality, none of the available options offer an easy solution. The current regime is widely criticized for repression and regional tensions, making international pressure understandable. Yet history repeatedly raises the same question. Not whether an existing regime is problematic, but whether what replaces it would truly be better. There is also a broader strategic consequence rarely discussed. Interventions that remove governments without nuclear deterrence send a powerful signal to other states. Leaders observing these events may conclude that possessing nuclear weapons is the only reliable protection against external intervention. Examples often cited include Libya and Iraq, compared with nuclear-armed states such as North Korea, which remain largely immune from regime change efforts. If this pattern continues, more countries may pursue nuclear capabilities simply to guarantee survival. The risk of failure, therefore, extends far beyond one nation. A miscalculation could reshape global security, accelerate nuclear proliferation, and leave an already fragile region facing instability that might take generations to repair.